To say that there was a lot of hype leading up to the release of the Mad Titan Shadow would be quite an understatement. I can still remember everybody's excitement as we waited for this box to come out, and wait we did, because at least in the United States, this box got delayed for a few months, so we really were waiting, and maybe that helped contribute to the hype. But I think most of it boiled down to just one word: Thanos. Because really, what else was there to be super excited about other than this was the next big release in our beloved game? The two heroes in the box, Spectrum and Adam Warlock, weren't exactly household names, and all we knew about the villains was that it was Thanos and some of his goons. So really, that doesn't make a recipe for a lot of hype, and I think that is just a testament to how powerful the MCU is, and particularly how incredible Infinity War and Endgame were in the movies, to get us all just so excited to see Thanos as a character and to wonder how the designers would handle him. And speaking of the designers, I think the hype also spoke to our faith in them, because after the Galaxy's Most Wanted was somewhat of a letdown, we were still super excited to see what came next. And I'm happy to report that what came next was a lot more enjoyable and really lived up to the hype in most ways. As always, this campaign box came with 2 heroes and 5 villains, so let's start out talking about the heroes. The first one we see here is Monica Rambeau, also known as Spectrum. She has a very interesting style where she is a form changer in the sense of Ant-Man and Wasp, where they can change into multiple forms. But instead of changing her size, she changes her energy form. So she has this gamma, photon, and pulsar form. And depending on which one of those you choose, she gets +2 to one of her stats. So she's the only hero that can potentially have 3 thwart or 3 attack or 3 defense, which makes her potentially very powerful. The trick is you can't just change forms whenever you want to. Pretty much her entire kit is dedicated to cards that allow you to change forms in one way or another, whether it's her signature ally that lets you change forms when he comes into play, or her attack, thwart, and defense events all also let you change forms, which makes for a very tricky and puzzly hero, because it is entirely possible that you might find yourself in the wrong form when you need to maybe remove a lot of threat. You're stuck in your attack form and don't have a way to change, or maybe you switch to your defense form and now you can't get out of it and your attack and thwart stats are both 1. So you really have to plan ahead. You really have to be very careful. But she has a lot of cards in her kit that lets her change forms, so it shouldn't happen too often. And her cards are very powerful. That she gets to remove 4 threat with her threat removal. She gets to do 7 damage and potentially overkill with her attack card. She has 2 resource producing upgrades, which is always appreciated. And when things are going very well, she can be a lot of fun to play. Now, I find when I play her, things often don't go well and I get stuck in the wrong form, but that's probably just me, honestly. You really do need to plan ahead and think your turns out, and I probably just play her too quickly. But she could be a lot of fun. I know she's a favorite of a few players. So even though you might not have known who she was going into the box, I think you'll find her to be a lot of fun to play. Now, she came with leadership cards and some exceptionally good leadership cards. Though I do want to say I find it strange that she came in leadership, because in my opinion, that's probably the worst aspect to play Spectrum in, because of the aforementioned potential of getting stuck in a form you don't want to be in. Leadership doesn't really necessarily help you out with that. Whereas if you're in aggression or justice, for example, you should have other cards in your hand that'll let you deal the damage you need or remove threat potentially. But in leadership, you've just got to rely on your allies, I guess. But she came with some amazing allies and some of my favorites. She had the Captain America ally. Finally, we could put him in any of our decks, and he's pretty solid. He looks expensive, but his cost gets reduced by the number of Avengers you have in play. So there's a good chance you could get him for pretty cheap. Power Man was just okay, and he plays all right in some combo builds. But really, it's all about White Tiger and Kalu. These 2 allies are so good, and they see a lot of play. White Tiger lets you draw cards equal to the villain's stage number, so especially an expert, you're going to draw at least 2 cards and maybe 3 when you play her. And Kalu lets you search the top 5 cards for an event. He is such a staple. I put him in pretty much every single leadership deck I play. He's awesome. She also came with Mighty Avengers, which was a huge card for a while that gives all of your allies +1 thwart and +1 attack if you are all Avenger characters. And so that led to a lot of fun deck builds. Mass Attack also sort of created its own deck build, all about trying to get the highest possible attack out of your hero and allies, and then you add it all together for one big shot. Can be a lot of fun. And Band Together was a huge card to come out for leadership. It gives you a resource for every ally you have in play, up to 3, and it's very easy to get this card to give you 3 resources. and there's no limit on it. You can include 3 of them in your deck, which usually cards like this are limited to 1 per deck, but you can put 3 in there. Now there is the risk if you draw it in your opening hand, you don't have any allies yet, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't even have any kind of resource in the bottom left, so you can't even just discard it to pay for something else. You're just stuck with it till the end of the turn. But as long as you can play at least 1 ally that turn, you can get some use out of it. And like I said, it's not hard to get 3 resources out of it. The Blade ally is also very good. There's not very many 1-cost allies in the game, so at the very least, he's a good blocker that can go in every single deck you build because he's basic. But he also has an interesting ability where he can attack or thwart without taking consequential damage, but you have to discard a card from your hand with the punch resource. So he was another really good ally. It also came with Ready to Rumble that works very well in form-changing heroes, that when you change your forms, you can discard it to Ready. Very, very useful in a lot of heroes. So she came with a ton of good cards. Spectrum was very, very welcome in the card pool. Adam Warlock is an incredibly interesting, strange hero. What they did with him was when you build a deck for him, you can include cards from every aspect, but you can only include 1 of each, and they have to balance perfectly. So you can have, 8 of each aspect or something like that, and then 1 of each card. And that sounds like a deck builder's dream, and in some ways it is, but in other ways it's pretty limiting. But let's look at his cards before I talk more about that. He has a really good ally, Pip the Troll. Soul World lets you heal back up to full if you've run through your deck once and put a counter on it, which is a really powerful card. He has a resource upgrade that's always nice to have. He has a cape that allows him to ready. But really the star of Adam Warlock are these Mystic Senses upgrades, because his ability is that he can discard a card from his hand, and depending on the aspect of that card, he gets a really good bonus, like he can deal damage, remove threat, or heal, things like that. So every turn you can use one of those different aspect cards in your hand to get a bonus. And then if you have Mystic Senses in play, after you do that, you get to draw a card back. And if you have both Mystic Senses in play, you get to draw 2 cards. So you get to discard a card to do something useful and then draw 2 cards back if you're fully set up. And then if you have the cape, you also get to ready. Now his stats are pretty low, so you're not going to get a lot out of that ready, but it's still pretty nice. And I gotta say, that loop of discarding a card to do some damage, say, and then drawing 2 cards back and readying your hero, in my opinion, that's one of the most fun things you can do with a hero in this game. I love that loop of doing that with him every turn. Getting him fully set up and getting to take advantage of all those powers is really, really fun. And since he has all the different aspects in his deck, his cards really play off of that, where his attack card and his threat card have you discard cards off the top of your deck. And depending on how many different aspects you reveal, increases their effectiveness, which is a fun way to play. And it all really sort of revolves around this Quantum Magic card that lets you go back into your discard pile and add a card back to your hand. And that's meant to make up for not only you discarding so many cards with his events, but also the fact that you can only have 1 of each card in your deck that you built with. And that allows you to get your combo pieces back out and stuff like that. Because I was saying, in some ways it's a deck builder's dream, because any combo you've ever thought of that would be really cool, but it requires more than 1 aspect to be played, you can do in Adam Warlock. The downside is you can only have 1 of each of those cards. It can be hard to pull those combos off. There's kind of some randomness there, but with Quantum Magic allowing you to get those cards back out of the discard pile, that definitely helps make it possible. The other potential downside for having all 4 aspects in his deck is it's entirely possible that someone could come up with the best possible deck for Adam Warlock, because he can use all the cards. And, at least with all the other heroes, they could have maybe a best possible deck in each aspect. But that's still 4 different ways to play each hero. With Adam Warlock, if there is a best deck out there, wink, and there might be, if you know, you know, then there's not a lot of room left for building decks, because why not just play the best one out there? But that doesn't take anything away from Adam Warlock. He's a really interesting hero, and you certainly can do a lot of different things with him. Now, his deck building cards were very interesting. We knew coming into the box that he was going to be this, he had this restriction of only 1 of each, so we were kind of wondering what kind of cards would he come with if he only had 1 of each. And they were very clever in how they put this together. So he has some allies, so of course you can only have 1 of each of those in your deck. And we see Marvel Boy here. He's a pretty decent ally, always happy to have a 2 cost. But one of the things they did was they created these Cosmic Entity cards, and I'm sad to say these were pretty disappointing. They're 2 cost events, 1 in each aspect, that you actually shuffle into the encounter deck. And when they are revealed from the encounter deck, they do a special thing for you. The attack one here will deal 2 damage to the villain, and then the card gets removed. And when I say when revealed, I should say if it gets revealed, because there's a really good chance these cards will simply get revealed as boost effects, or get discarded to some other effect in the encounter deck, and you won't get anything for the 2 resources you paid to put that into the encounter deck. And so they just felt really, really underpowered. It's awesome when it works. You know, the fact that one of those could come out and instead of getting an encounter card, you get a good thing happen to you. And I suspect that's why the cost is high. The designers really valued the potential to cancel a card. But more often than not, they just get lost, and then you wasted your resources. So the Cosmic Entities are pretty disappointing. But thankfully, they also made some new Mystic events that were not disappointing at all. There's one in each aspect. Here we have Magic Attack that you can only play if you're a Mystic, and you can only have 1 per deck, so that fits perfectly for his style. And they're all pretty powerful. This one lets you deal up to 5 damage to an enemy for 1. And it came with some other cards that you'd only have 1 of, like Combat Training. There's no reason to put more than 1 in your deck anyway. They also had these special resource cards that were max 1 per deck that you spend it as a wild resource, and then it also does some other benefit, which was pretty neat. So they came up with some clever ways. If you were going to make a hero that can only include 1 type of each card in their deck, it was cool that they made a bunch of cards that you'd only have 1 in your deck anyway. So we certainly appreciated that style. Looking at his Justice Suite here, Quasar is a really good ally, another terrible cosmic entity. Here's the Mystic event for thwarting that removes up to 4 threat for 1. Very, very good. The blue ally Major Victory was pretty good for Guardian heroes. I forgot to mention that Adam Warlock is a Guardian, so he's another person that you can play with all those Guardian cards, which makes him pretty strong too. The summoning spell was the blue Mystic card, was very, very good. That lets you discard cards from the top of your deck until you get an ally. That's just a fun, who knows what you're going to get, can be a really powerful ability. And then with the protection cards, these were a little bit less exciting. The Gardener, here's your green cosmic entity, not that good. Charlie 27 as an ally is just okay. But the shield spell was pretty good for Mystics, pretty much blocks all of the attack at the cost of discarding cards off the top of your deck. And he came with 1 neutral ally, Martin X, who's pretty much just okay. So overall, Adam Warlock was, I would say, kind of a middle tier hero, but he can be a lot of fun. And if you have a lot of cool combos you want to try out, he's pretty much the only one that can do them across aspects. And so you can have a lot of fun doing that. I would just say, if you are interested in building decks for him, don't look around on the internet to see if maybe there's a really, really good one, because there just might be. Now, I said there was a lot of hype around this box, even though we didn't really know what most of the villains were going to be. And I think it kind of didn't matter, because the only villains we'd gotten for a really long time were the Galaxy's Most Wanted villains. And I made my feelings pretty clear that we only really got a couple that, at least for me personally, I've felt like playing very often. So it had been a really, really long time since we'd gotten a lot of villains that we were excited to play, that maybe we would actually play multiple times before we got frustrated by them. And I am very, very happy to say that all the villains in this box are really good. This is an exceptionally good campaign. It is really fun to play. I really like all the villains. I'm not saying some of them aren't hard. They are, but they're hard in a way that feels more fair and makes you want to come back and try over and over again instead of throwing your hands up in frustration. Starting off with Ebony Maw, which is one of my favorites in the box. They always do a good job with the first villain in a campaign. I've noticed that Crossbones, Drang, and now Ebony Maw. The first villain in the campaign always seems to be a nice, good starter with a little bit of challenge, but not too hard, but fun mechanism. So kudos to that. Ebony Maw's whole thing is he is a mystic himself, so he gets to play spells, and his spells all have surge, and when they come into play, they have counters on them. Let me see if I can find one. The Fireball has 4 counters on them, and every time he activates against you, so if he schemes or attacks, you have to take 1 counter off every spell in front of you, and then when the last counter is removed, they fire. So Fireball here is going to deal 4 damage to you, and that makes for a lot of fun, because you can see what's going to happen to you coming, and you can kind of predict how long it's going to take. But if he gets extra activations, they're going to happen faster. And he has other cards too that will tick the counters off of him, so that'll speed it up as well. So he has the Fireball, does a lot of damage. Pacification will make you discard an upgrade and stun you. Rebel Storm will take out your allies. And he has one that confuses you as well, Manipulation. So he kind of has a little bit of everything. Depending on when they come out and how often they fire, he can be a little bit harder or a little bit easier. He's not too tough though. But he just makes for a fun challenge. He's pretty variable thanks to the different spells coming out. It's kind of annoying that they have Surge, but they don't do anything right away anyway, so I think that's a totally fine use of Surge. And overall, just really, really pleased with how Ebony Maw plays. The second scenario is another one that I really like. I play this scenario quite often. This is the tower defense where you're fighting off Proxima Midnight and Corvus Glaive. Now, if you don't recognize any of these names, you can be forgiven for that. These characters were in Infinity War, but they aren't necessarily super memorable. These are just sort of the people who hang out with Thanos, his hit squad, I guess. But these guys make for a really interesting scenario. You actually have to fight two villains at the same time. Now, this wasn't the first time we had seen something like that, but this one is handled much better than it was with the Wrecking Crew. And they each have their own main scheme, and you don't lose when the scheme threats out. Instead, that causes a terrible thing to happen because you're trying to protect this Avengers Tower, and it gets damage counters, and if one of the schemes maxes out, then you put a lot of damage on it, and if you let it get to be too much, it gets damaged, and then you flip it over, and then if it gets too much again, you lose. You have to be very careful to protect the tower. Now, I will say most of the time it's not too hard to protect the tower. If you're playing in the campaign, you really don't want to let it flip, so you only have about half as much damage, and that can be a little more challenging. But if you're just playing the standalone and you have the full both sides before you lose, then it's pretty easy. This is not a difficult scenario, but it is really fun to play. You have to bring both of the villains down to 0 health before they're defeated, and they just have a lot of fun effects. They have good minions, they have interesting treacheries. They're just overall a really straightforward scenario, but that makes it fun to play. You don't have to build any kind of specific deck against it. It just works really well. And I really like it. I get it out quite often. And then we come to the Titan himself. Now, you might have expected Thanos to be the final villain in the box, and so did we all. But if you don't know who they are, I won't ruin the surprise till we get down there. But Thanos is actually only the 3rd villain in the box, and he is everything you would want him to be. He is incredibly difficult. He is very tough. He is very strong. But surprisingly, he's still very fun. You know, I said a lot of mean things about Ronan being just too good at everything and just too hard. He's relentless. He just never stops. But Thanos, he's hard, but he's not, I don't know, he's not impossible. He will beat you probably more often than you beat him, but he's a lot of fun to play. He does have Stalwart built in, which can be annoying. You can never stun or confuse him. But I think that's largely because he also comes with the Infinity Gauntlet modular set, and we'll talk about that when we get there, but that's a big part of what makes him so difficult, and the Infinity Gauntlet doesn't trigger if the character doesn't activate, so I think they wanted to make sure that Thanos could always activate, so the Gauntlet would always trigger. That's such a big part of his character and such a big part of the scenario. But yeah, he is really cool. He did not disappoint at all, particularly in his main scheme. I won't ruin this for you, so if you're watching this, a little bit of a spoiler here, but if you fail to stop his first scheme from advancing, the snap from the movies happens and you have to remove half your deck from the game. It's very clever, it's very cute, but it's also very devastating if it happens, because if the wrong cards get removed from the game, it's really tough to finish the scenario. And he is pretty tough. He's got a lot of attachments that make him harder. He has a lot of good treacheries. Avatar of Death is particularly scary, that he attacks you and he gets overkill and piercing. So even if you had a chump blocker, even if you had a tough status, you're still taking the full effect, and he hits really, really hard. He often has an extra boost card or two, and he gets powered up with things like Master of the Stones. Now, we should talk about the Infinity Gauntlet. Normally, I wait till we get to the encounter sets, but let me scroll down here. The way the Infinity Gauntlet works is it is an attachment that goes on the villain at the beginning of the game, and it gives them +1 scheme and +1 attack, so Thanos is hitting you even harder. And then there is a deck of these 6 Infinity Stone cards that gets shuffled up and set to the side. And every time the villain activates, you also activate any of the Infinity Stones that are in play. And they do pretty much everything that the bad guys can do in this game. They'll confuse you, they'll stun you, they'll spit out minions, they'll cause you to lose your upgrades, they will discard cards off your deck and add threat to the main scheme. They just do a little bit of everything. And you're either getting one of those out every turn or they're activating every turn. So you're constantly being hampered by status effects, by extra effects. It's basically like the villain gets an extra encounter card every other activation. And those really add up. This makes things really tough. And the neat thing about the Infinity Gauntlet is it can be used with any villain. So anybody that you want to make a lot harder, you can pair with the Infinity Gauntlet, and it makes the scenario very different. So I am so thrilled with the design of this, that they made it a modular encounter set and they didn't just make it part of Thanos' scenario. I thought that was a stroke of genius. That could have just as easily been, like I said, just a part of a scenario that was tied directly to him and no one else. But the fact that they popped it out and made it modular was such a smart idea. So I did want to show you that while we were still talking about Thanos. But if we look at his cards themselves, they're really not that bad. He gets tough, he gets an extra boost here and there. His attachments are pretty annoying. And that Avatar of Death is a scary card, but overall, his kit really isn't that bad. It's the Infinity Gauntlet that makes him particularly tough. Plus, he has a lot of hit points and he hits really, really hard. But there's plenty of room on his scheme that if you need to flip down and heal, you should be able to. It goes up to 12 before he snaps and you lose half your deck. So he's really not that overly difficult. You need to bring a strong deck, and you definitely want to be aware that you're going to be stunned and confused all the time. So if you can bring any kind of help against those types of cards, that would be wise. But they did an amazing job of making Thanos difficult but fun to play. You always feel like you've got a chance. Again, I have nothing but praise for everything we've seen so far in this box. And that's not going to stop with the fourth scenario, because Hela, surprise, surprise, is strangely in this. Now, if you read the story of the campaign, the idea is that Loki has tricked Thanos and he has taken the Infinity Gauntlet for himself, so he's brought his sister along for the ride. So Hela and Loki are the final villains in the box, and Hela is just an amazing scenario. She plays so differently than almost every other villain. In some ways, she is similar to the Collector 2 scenario in that it's much less about defeating her with hit points. It's more about questing through, or sorry, Lord of the Rings speak, thwarting through her side schemes that she keeps putting out. But you have to keep descending further and further into the depths of hell, where there's basically 3 stages to the scenario, where there will be a side scheme and a guard. So here's the 3 side schemes that make up the main part of the scenario, and then there's these 3 sizable minions that are bigger based on the number of players that guard them. So you have to defeat the minion, then you have to clear all the threat off the side scheme, and then you move on to the next one, which spits out another big minion in the next side scheme. And once you've cleared all 3 of these side schemes, you rescue Odin, which is the whole point of this scenario. And then he joins you, which is really neat. And in the campaign mode, you can actually get him flipped over to this version of Odin, which is just awesome. And you get to play with him. But usually by then the game's about over, so you probably only get 1 or 2 good smacks with him. But it's still so neat thematically that you can rescue him and you can flip him to his king side. And so just the concept of this, just having to work your way through these large minions and then these side schemes, just makes for a really fun way to play. It's very different. Hela herself starts out pretty easy. Her stats are low and she doesn't hit very hard. But every single time you add one of these side schemes to the victory display, she gets stronger. She gets more hit points, her stats increase. So the longer the game goes on and the farther you get into it, the scarier she gets. So you have to keep that in mind. Now, unfortunately, it's a little gameable in the sense that if you just hang out in the first side scheme with the first minion and you don't proceed, Hela never gets stronger. And so you can just kind of wait till you're fully ready to progress. But that's a minor quibble because it's such a fun scenario, and you don't have to do that if you don't want to. If you want to push yourself, just keep pushing through as fast as you can and see if you can keep up with Hela getting stronger. That's the way I usually play it, just because it's more fun, and I think it's the way they kind of thought it was going to happen. But you really can just hang out in the first spot if you want to. But she just has a lot of cool cards, and she's such a cool looking character. I've always been a fan of this. I like the Asgard stuff a lot already, and I was very, very happy that was the direction this box went in. You know, we were already in space with Galaxy's Most Wanted, and then we felt like we were in space a little bit at the beginning of the Mad Titan Shadow. So we take this left turn into the Asgard stuff. That was pretty welcome. I was very pleased to see that. And this is a top villain, I think, on a lot of people's lists. This one gets played a lot. I think people really, really like Hela. And so we're 4 for 4 at this point. It's a great box. Now, Loki's not one of my favorite villains, but he's not bad. He's not bad. He's really hard. He also has the Infinity Gauntlet as part of his scenario, and that just makes every villain harder. But I don't want to say too much negative because it is such an interesting scenario. There's 5 versions of Loki. They really leaned into the shapeshifter element of him, where every time you defeat one, a different one, a random one pops out, and there's other cards in his deck that will have the different Lokis switch in and out, and they all have different stats. They all have different abilities. A couple of them have Stalwart, which is really annoying. One of them has Retaliate, things like that. And there's stats switch around, so you're never quite sure, is he going to be scheming a lot? Is he going to be attacking a lot? So that's a really neat element of the scenario. And like I said, he has the gauntlet, so that part's hard. You're always getting stunned and confused, losing your stuff. And his kit, unlike Thanos's, his kit's pretty nasty. He's got a lot of really nasty side schemes that can do some unfriendly things to you. He gets a lot of extra attacks and schemes. He is difficult to flip down on because he usually schemes pretty high, so you have to be very careful that you don't lose the main scheme. But the thing that makes the Loki the most annoying, because he can be very annoying at times, is not so much his kit, but it's the recommended encounter sets that come with him. We'll look at it when we get there. Well, I won't jump down there just now, but Enchantress is one of the modular encounter sets in this one. And that is one of my least favorite encounter sets in the whole game. That's incredibly annoying. So if you do find Loki being a bit irritating, if you just take the Enchantress one out and swap it with something else, I find he's a lot more fun to play. Now, the way he works, because there's 5 versions of him, they all have 20 hit points, and it doesn't matter, which stage you're on. It's just always 20 hit points per player. And if you're playing in standard, you're meant to defeat 2 Lokis, and if you're playing in expert, you're meant to defeat 3. So instead of having multiple stages in that way, they're all just stage 1s. You just have to defeat multiple of them. So there's some strategy in trying to defeat certain ones. Like if the Stalwart one comes out, you might want to try to defeat that if you're hoping to stun and confuse. There's really some really good strategy in how you're going to approach Loki. He can be a little fiddly at times. You have to be very careful to read everything because various things are happening sort of all over the place. Like one of the things when you defeat a Loki, you're also supposed to spit out a side scheme from the encounter deck. I find I miss that a lot. So you have to be sort of careful to read. He's got a lot going on. But now this isn't a scenario I play all the time. So I'm going to say we're 5 for 5. I do think every villain is really good, but I don't get out Loki very often just because he's pretty tough. I would say he's the hardest villain in the box. He's harder than Thanos in my opinion, but that's not a bad thing. It's not a negative. Just giving my opinions on that. After everything I had to say about Galaxy's Most Wanted, all the frustrations, the disappointment, this was such a breath of fresh air. Everything here was really good, and I'm not even done heaping praise on it. We'll go through the modular sets. These are actually, if there's anything that I would say is slightly less exciting in this box, the modular sets are nothing special. I don't really play with these very often. The Black Order gives you some of Thanos' goons, some pretty nasty villains to deal with. Blood Despair is just a horrible card in multiplayer. Armies of Titan gives you some little guys to play against with some annoying effect. They're okay. They're not bad or anything, but these I do find to be a little less exciting than some of the other encounter sets out there. Children of Thanos is okay. Adds some pretty beefy minions to deal with and a couple side schemes. And of course, again, we have the Infinity Gauntlet that can go in any villain, which I already said how awesome that was, but it's still awesome. Legions of Hell is kind of weird because it's called Legions, but there's only 2 little zombie guys in it. I always thought there should be more Legions in the Legions of Hell, but it does come with these Fallen Warrior cards, which is kind of cool. It'll take your allies away and make them zombies. That's pretty neat. So this one's an okay one to include sometimes. That's pretty fun. The Frost Giants is actually a really good one. This one is really hard. It has a Laufey, so Loki's dad, and just a lot of, well, not a lot, but 3 pretty strong minions. And this Frozen card and the Natural Storm card are annoying that they keep you from readying. So this will really add some challenge to an encounter deck. And then we come to Enchantress, and this one is just so annoying. I never ever choose to include this in a deck. She herself, when she comes out, she also comes with this copy of a card called Seduce that makes it so that you can't do basic attacks or attack events, and you have to go to Alter Ego to get rid of it. This card can be crippling depending on the hero you're playing. It might be hard for you to get to Alter Ego. It certainly can be against Loki because he schemes so well, but you can't attack or play attack events, so it's really hard to kill the villain when there's nothing you can do to deal damage apart from your allies. You have to get rid of it. And Beguiled also steals your allies, so there's that. Can't even use your allies to attack because they're being beguiled. So yeah, I do not like Enchantress. I never use her, and when I play Loki, I take her out because it's just, I don't want to deal with that stress in my life. But where the huge praise continues is with the way the campaign is handled. This is my kind of campaign. Now, I talked about how the Galaxy's Most Wanted, the market system is really cool, and it was, but it's just a little fiddly trying to get those victory points so that you can get the better cards, and it's hard to get them. You have to decide which ones you want to get, and that can be a lot of fun. But I like the campaigns in this game to be a little simpler because for me, this is more of a pick up and play. It doesn't need to be that complicated. And so the campaign in this one, pretty much just with every scenario, there is a side scheme that starts in play. And if you clear that side scheme, you get some sort of benefit. So in the first one, if you secure this landing pad, you get Cosmo, and he's going to hang out with you for a couple scenarios. But there's also some negative things that can happen, that you can get certain cards like Security Breach shuffled into the deck. So the campaign just plays very simply. The Two Towers one has the Save the Shawarma place, which leads to the potential of getting these Shawarma cards in your deck. You can have one of them that's one of each resource. That's awesome. You always save the Shawarma place. Now, it does make you fight Black Swan here, but then you get a Shawarma in your deck for the rest of the campaign, and that's just awesome. And that's how they all are. You just have one side scheme that you have to complete, and then you get some kind of awesome benefit. The Hela scenario has Find the Norn Stones, and then you get a Norn Stone, and you get a boost to all your stats, and then you can use it to ready and heal. These cards are just awesome. And then in the Loki scenario, if you open the dungeons, you get a powerful ally, similar to how in Taskmaster you can rescue those free allies. This kind of works the same way. And there's always a cost. There's always some negative thing that happens, but then you get some really good benefit, and it keeps it simple. You don't have to keep track of a lot of stuff, and they're all just really fun benefits. They really make you feel like your deck is getting more powerful, and it makes just for a great experience. I have absolutely nothing to say but good things about the Mad Titan Shadow. They absolutely knocked it out of the park. The hype was well warranted. It was earned. It paid off, and this is still a box I like to revisit. I've said in the past I don't always play the campaigns very much, and it's not because I think they're bad. It's just because I tend to have a short attention span with this game, and as often as I get to play it, I don't usually end up completing a campaign I started because I'm ready to move on to another hero, to another villain. So that's the only reason I don't play them. But this one I've played, I don't think I've ever completed it because I never do, but this is one at least every time I play, I start a campaign because I'm excited to get that shawarma. I'm excited to get Cosmo. And one of these days, if I ever complete a campaign, it's probably going to be this one because I think this is a really, really well done one. So kudos to the designers. This box was extremely well done. Now, when we start talking about the hero packs that followed this cycle, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. There's some good and there's some mediocre coming here. This felt like a really strange sort of catch-all wave. We've got a Guardian hero, an Avengers hero, Scenario pack we'll talk about here in a minute, an Asgard hero, and then another Avenger. So usually it feels like the cycles are a little bit more cohesive in that they all focus on, one team. We just had nothing but Guardians. But even in the box here, we had Spectrum, who was an Avenger, and Adam Warlock, who was a Guardian. So that was just really kind of where we were at, sort of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And the cycle sort of reflected that. These felt like the heroes that they just hadn't got around to, and they were maybe waiting for something bigger to come along. And I don't know that there was a lot of hype going into this wave. When these heroes were announced, they all looked fun to play, but they weren't the big names that we were kind of used to seeing. That being said, there's a couple heroes I really like, so let's dig into these. We'll start out with Nebula, who I'm a big fan of. For everything negative I had to say about the Nebula villain scenario, I think you can pretty much flip it all on its head and say positive things about the Nebula hero. I think she's a ton of fun. I play her quite often. Had a really good time with her. They did something really neat with her where she has the same general gimmick that her villain does because she's the same person, so that's how she works. And I think that was a really clever idea. She also uses these techniques, and they work in a similar way where once they're in play, they just have to fire, similar to how when she's in her villain form and she has her techniques, they just go off every time she activates. Hers, she puts these one-cost upgrades into play, and they all give her a special ability that's going to happen when they fire, which is always at the beginning of the hero phase. But they also give her some sort of passive ability that you can play off of. They give her piercing and overkill, or they might give her retaliate, things like that. And it can be a little random, but it's fun to try to deck build towards some of these certain abilities because there's ways to shuffle these cards back into the deck so you can somewhat count on them. She plays somewhat similarly to Black Widow in that when she plays one of these techniques in her alter ego form, she draws cards similar to how Black Widow does with her preparations. And so it's kind of neat to see another take on a similar idea. And they're all really powerful. They remove threat, they deal damage, they stun or confuse. They give Nebula a tough, just a bunch of useful abilities, and they only cost one. They're easy to get into play. You have this combat ready card that in your alter ego allow you to shuffle two of them back into your deck. So like I said, you can be actually decently consistent with them. Wide stance I love. It lets you look at the top three cards in the encounter deck, discard one, and put the other two back. There's not a lot of scrying in this game, and that's a really powerful thing in solo, that you know exactly what's coming that villain phase. I shuffle this one back in quite often, actually. There was just something about the way she played, very different, and that's true across the board. If I haven't said this yet, Marvel Champions, it's incredible how every hero plays so differently, and they all really do have their own feel, and they do feel like the heroes they're meant to represent. And this is just another one that feels very different, and this one really spoke to me. I fell in love with Nebula. I was calling her my favorite hero there for a minute. Now, as she's fallen back into the pack a little bit, but she's still pretty high up for me. And I really enjoy her. You can build a lot of interesting decks for her. She plays pretty well in just about every aspect, and she's just really good. So I really recommend Nebula. And her deck building cards, she had some really, really good ones. Eros was a pretty decent 2-cost ally. Wraith can cancel boost effects, which there's not a lot of that in the game, so that was pretty neat. Venom, it's neat that we have a Venom ally, but he's a little bit hard to get moving, but when he does, he's really strong. Justice Served gave away to ready heroes just for removing all the threat from a scheme. That's a useful thing. But really, the big card here is one way or another. This card took the game by storm, quickly became probably the best card in the game, or one of them, where it lets you search the encounter deck for a side scheme and put it into play. That's not fun. But then it lets you draw 3 cards and only costs 0. And so just on the surface right there, drawing 3 cards just at the cost of a side scheme, that one tends to be a wash because it's probably going to take you 2 or 3 cards to get rid of that side scheme. But there are a lot of cards in this game that you can attach to side schemes or that give you benefits for clearing side schemes. So this instantly created its own deck archetype where you just wanted to find all the side schemes, and then when you completed them, you could get damage with followed. You could, later on, there's a card that lets you go find an ally when you clear a side scheme. You get to draw cards with things like Clear the Area and Skilled Investigator. So there is a lot you can do, and similar to the minion summoning builds that the heroes got bonuses from summoning and then killing minions, one way or another did the same thing for side schemes for Justice, and it made for a really, really fun deck that works pretty well for just about any hero. So that card was an instant sensation. Brains over Brawn, not quite so much. It lets you deal damage equal to your thwart after you thwart, but there's not a lot of heroes that have a high enough thwart to make a 2-cost event just to deal some damage be that effective. It's okay. She came with another copy of Cosmo and another copy of Nowhere. She had a team up card with Gamora that lets you draw 3 cards. That's pretty strong. One thing that's very interesting about her, I have completely ignored the Obligations and Nemesis sets as I've gone through these just because I didn't want to spend a lot of time on them. But hers is really interesting in that her Nemesis set is her sister Gamora, but her signature ally is also Gamora. So it's entirely possible that you could have played your signature ally and then gotten Shadows of the Past, and the bad guy version of Gamora, not really, but just the one that doesn't like Nebula, pops out, she makes your ally go away, and then she gives you all kinds of trouble. So I thought that was really clever how they handled that. But one thing that can be really fun is if you're playing her next to Gamora hero, if her Shadows of the Past does come out, this side scheme here, it says Gamora gets +1 attack and her attacks gain piercing. And that just says Gamora. It's not specifically referring to the Nemesis minion. So if somebody is playing the hero Gamora, this is actually a huge benefit and can be really funny when it happens. There's also this card Lethal Weapon that gets attached to Gamora that will also give her +1 attack. So when you're playing Nebula and somebody else on the table is playing Gamora, you're actually hoping for Shadows of the Past. And you have wide stance in your deck, so it's entirely possible you could help float to the top. So it's pretty fun when that kind of thing can happen in this game. Her off aspect cards are really good too. Energy Spear became a very popular upgrade that you can put on a Guardian ally, gives it +2 attack and piercing. A popular target for this is Bug because he's so easy to keep alive, and so that is a really powerful card. Just being able to get piercing but +2 attack is really strong too. Guardians of the Galaxy is an incredibly fun card where, similar to the Mighty Avengers, it is a team card in that it's meant to be played only if all of your characters have the Guardian trait. And it says that after you play an upgrade on an ally, draw a card. There's actually quite a few good upgrades that can go on allies and particularly Guardians allies, and so this can draw you a lot of cards and made for some really fun deck builds. I've enjoyed that quite a lot in Star-Lord and Rocket as well. This deck also introduced these training cards, which are interesting. I don't know that they've really come into their own just yet, but there's supports that you can use to shuffle cards of their certain aspect back into your deck in Alter Ego, so it helps fuel your combos, keep things up and running. It just, at least for me in solo, I don't always get to Alter Ego as often as I like, so I might not make a lot of use of these training cards, but they're certainly interesting. I got an Honorary Guardian if you want to turn somebody into a Guardian ally, and she came with an extra copy of the team up card so that you could give it to Gamora. So Nebula, top tier for me, huge fun factor. I really like Nebula. War Machine is next up, and he plays quite a bit more straightforwardly than Nebula, where Nebula has quite a varied experience depending on which techniques you draw and which ones you can get into play. War Machine is really straightforward in that he just has bullets and he wants to shoot them. His whole thing is he gets these ammo counters. When he flips into hero form, he gets 5 of them. And then a lot of his upgrades and events cost ammo counters in addition to the resources that they cost in order to do a lot of damage. And damage is the key word here. War Machine is all about just damage and not much else. He has a lot of support for that. We have the munitions bunker here that can give him extra ammo counters. The upgraded chassis is really cool, is that whenever he flips into hero form, it gives him a tough status card. And since you pretty much have to flip to Alter Ego as often as possible, because that's really the only way to replenish your ammo counters is to flip down and then flip back up. That's going to be a lot of tough statuses if you can get that into play early. He has gauntlet guns that help supply some of the resources and ammo for all his events. The thing that makes War Machine a little tricky, at least in solo, is he's pretty bad at thwarting. He only has a 1 thwart stat, and I mentioned this earlier, heroes that only have a 1 thwart stat and require you to flip down a lot There's actually 2 of them in this cycle. They don't usually work well for me personally, and I'm sad to say War Machine is probably one of my least favorite heroes, but he has his fans. I'm not saying he's bad by any means. He just doesn't fit my particular playstyle very well, in that he really is, if you're super into damage, if you're playing especially in multiplayer, and it's your job to carry the damage to the villain, and you're playing War Machine, I think you're going to have a lot of fun. He is singular in focus, and he does his job well. And it is nice when you go to Alter Ego, James Rhodes' ability is that you can shuffle a War Machine card back into your deck. That is often this targeted strike card, at least in solo, because it's his only way to remove threat. So it's nice to be able to get any of his cards back that you might have missed out on the first time around. He has some crazy powerful events that seem cheap in resources, but it's because you also have to pay the ammo counters. So he has a dual economy in that way. Like this full auto here costs 2 and does 8 damage with overkill, which is obviously nuts for 2 resources, but he also costs you 4 of your ammo counters. So just about all of your ammo counters for the turn is going into that. So he's really, really good at damage, not much else. So he's not one of my favorites, but he's okay, and I know there's a lot of people that really like him, so I don't want to be too hard on him at all. He came in leadership, and he came with a sort of a brand new archetype. There's a lot of good cards in here. Black Panther, Captain Marvel, and then they reprinted Falcon for him. All have these powerful when they enter play effects, and the reason why is because of sneak attack right here that lets you play an ally from your hand for 1. So you pay 1 for the sneak attack, and then you can just take any ally in your hand that shares a trait with your identity, and that is very key because that makes the cards pretty limiting, actually. So if you're an Avenger and you want to play sneak attack, you're only going to use it on Avengers allies, Guardians allies, and so on. But it lets that powerful ally come into play. So we have all these very expensive allies that you're meant to sneak attack in, and then you're going to get their powerful coming into play effect that can do a lot of cool things. We have these command teams that are a support that stay on the table, and you can exhaust them to ready an ally. And so you're meant to be able to use these a couple times, and then sneak attack makes that ally go away at the end of the phase. And that sounds like a lot of fun, and it probably is when it works, but the way Marvel Champions works is that your hand cycles from turn to turn. So you have to get pretty lucky to get a sneak attack and one of these allies into your hand at the same time. Now there are certainly combos and things. Black Panther here can hold on to an event for you, so they tried to compensate for that by there are ways to make that work. I've never been able to pull it off, but it seems like it would be really fun. And as more and more cards come into the card pool, I'm sure there will be even more combos that make this worthwhile. It was something we were very excited about, and at least with everybody I've spoken to, it turned out to be kind of a disappointing thing that we could never quite get sneak attack to work, but it remains a fun potential archetype out there that's only going to get better as more cards get released. And then we also got some other cards that played into it. Go Down Swinging here and Save the Day is used to discard your powerful allies instead of letting them get shuffled away with sneak attack, and then you get benefits based on their cost, so they work particularly well with expensive ones. So this whole kit, everything he came with was meant to be this sneak attack, and I think they just really put it in the wrong hero because he does not have the economy at all to fuel all these things, to get these cards into his hand. He doesn't really have any extra card draw or anything, so it's a really fun thing. I think if you took this pack and shoved it into a different hero who had a little bit better economy, a little more card draw, you could probably make this whole thing work a little bit better. And then he came with another Quinn carrier. That's always nice. He had a team up card with Iron Man, so he does have the Iron Man signature ally, but you could also use it, of course, with the Iron Man hero, which was pretty cool. Love the team up cards, love the concept. They are really, really fun, and I'm so glad they came up with these. And then his off aspect cards, they introduced these alliance cards in his pack, and these alliance cards are meant to have very powerful effects. The keyword alliance means that any players at the table can help pay for these, both in the resource cost, and they also have the cost of exhausting an Avenger character and a Guardian character, and those can be across the table. Other different players can pay all of these costs, which is really neat. And then you combine those heroes' stats to have powerful effects as one, deals a bunch of damage, and this stand together down here, if you exhaust them both, you prevent a lot of damage and then deal damage back to the enemy. So 4 is expensive, but when it can be paid for by multiple players, it definitely comes down. So that was a really neat concept, very fun. Here we have the yellow training card that lets you shuffle justice cards back in, and sidearm is a pretty good attachment that is in basic, so it was nice. You can use it in any deck, and it gives an ally +1 attack and ranged. And then he came with an extra copy of 2 Against the World so that you could give it to the Iron Man player. So like I said, not one of my favorite heroes, actually probably my second least favorite hero, but even then I don't hate him. He's still fun. It's not that's a lot to say about this game. I love this game so much, and even my absolute least favorite heroes, I still think they're pretty good. So that's not saying too much. The next thing that came out was the Hood Scenario Pack, and that was really exciting because we hadn't seen a scenario pack in a while, and this thing is a doozy. There is so much value crammed into this pack. I can't even believe it. This thing is so, so good. So we start out, we have this villain, and his whole deal is he's all about modular encounter sets. When you set up a game against the Hood, you go through your collection, you pick out 7 different modular encounter sets and set them aside. And then over the course of the game, he's going to shuffle these encounter sets into his deck. So it's an incredibly variable experience every single time you play him. And his whole mechanism revolves around having these different encounter sets, because when he triggers his foul play ability, he discards cards from the top of his deck. And if they aren't from his encounter set, if they don't say the Hood at the bottom, then they get dealt to you as extra encounter cards. So he wants to put modular encounter sets into his deck, and then he's going to deal them to you as extra encounter cards. So the more modular encounter sets he has in his deck, the more likely you are to not be flipping over his cards, so you'll be getting extra cards. So he can be just really variable. You're never quite sure what you're going to get with the Hood. You can really control the difficulty, because depending on how difficult the encounter sets you grab are, you know, it could be really easy, could be really hard. Now, some people have referred to him as Surge the Villain, and that is not an unfair thing to say. You know, his whole ability is dealing you extra encounter cards, and it does happen quite often. I guess that's meant to be compensated a little bit by the fact that you're going to know what they are, but you're still getting a lot of extra encounter cards from him. And that's mostly what he does. His cards themselves really aren't that scary. They pretty much just keep trying to trigger that ability that might make you get extra cards. His scheme numbers are kind of low, so it's somewhat easy to lose the scheme, especially this first one is only 5, and he definitely gets harder the more schemes that you lose. So you want to try to keep him on the first scheme if you possibly can. He has these pistols that will increase his stats, so that will definitely make him a little bit harder to deal with. But overall, he's mainly just about adding these extra encounter sets, and I've said many times that I am a huge fan of the modular encounter sets in this game. So I am all about this villain. I'm a huge fan of the Hood. Some people don't like him because he really doesn't do anything other than spit out a bunch of encounter cards. I think that's fair, but I really like customizing scenarios. You know, I've gone through and found the 7 modular encounter sets with the most minions and just used all those to see how many minions he could pump out. I've gone through and taken the ones that were like the boss minion scenarios, so just to get the biggest ones in there. There's a lot of different ways you can craft a Hood scenario, and the theme of it is just over the top. It's so good. And because you're meant to include 7 modular encounter sets when you play him, handily, he came with 9 new encounter sets. 9. That is so awesome. There's added so much variety to your game. Even if you never want to play the Hood, just getting those 9 encounter sets made this package worth it alone. And I think they're all really good. Beastie Boys is a really interesting, adds these annoying, sometimes when I say annoying, I don't mean that in a bad way, just because, you know, the game can be annoying, but in a fun way. These somewhat annoying big minions, and then cards that support them. Brothers Grimm added a lot of attachments for allies. So this is fun to play in something like Zola that already has a lot of attachments for allies. It's fun to add even more. So these were really cool. Mr. Hyde is a terrifying encounter set where you get this 10 health minion that's going to come out and just wreck your day. And there's a lot of cards that support him and make him really scary. We get the Wrecking Crew as an encounter set, which was fun. You know, we had them as a scenario pack that I think people sort of forgot about relatively quickly. But they're cool characters, and it's nice that now we have them in the game as a modular encounter set. So you can always be playing against the Wrecking Crew if you want to, and they are very strong. They're going to make any deck you put them in much harder. I really like using these guys in sets that already have beefy minion sets, like Claw usually uses the Masters of Evil. I like to swap them out for the Wrecking Crew. These are a really good one. The Sinister Syndicate is sort of medium-sized minions with a lot of annoying abilities. This one is really strong. Crossfire's crew is pretty much the same thing. Medium-sized minions with really good abilities. They're all just so well made. And it was also a great way to get a ton more characters into the game as well. If you're into the Marvel theme, as I am, it's just fun to see a lot of these names. You know, a lot of these people aren't ever going to be villains in the game, but this was a cool way to get a lot of these small-time villains into the game this way. Ransacked Armory adds a bunch more attachments to villains that are just really cool. This Flamethrower gives a minion +3 attack. That's what? It's so terrifying. A couple more Armored Guards, so if you wanted more guard in the deck, that would be a way to do that. State of Emergency just adds a bunch of side schemes with when revealed effects, and then cards that make those when revealed effects happen again This one can be really fun, especially if you're using the One Way or Another from Nebula. This is a way to make that card, balance that card a little bit, because when you bring these out, at least you're going to have to do something nasty to yourself to get your 3 cards. But that one's really fun. The Streets of Mayhem is fascinating. I'm sorry, I keep saying all these like superlative words. Like they're all so good. This is such a good pack. The Streets of Mayhem adds these location settings that all have some sort of ongoing effect when they come to play. This gives every character Retaliate. One gives every character Steady. One gives every enemy an acceleration icon, but every hero and ally a +1/4. They're just so weird and cool. And one gives every character an attack +1 attack. So this really can modify your game. Now, when I use this encounter set, I usually include another one on top of it, because these do surge, so they don't really take up space in the encounter deck, and they don't really do anything as far as what the villain's trying to do. So I recommend, if you use the Streets of Mayhem, throw another one in there too, but that one is really neat. Another thing came with that has been a bit more of a mixed bag is they decided one of the cool ways that they could increase the difficulty of the game, and I agree with the concept, is they made Standard 2 and Expert 2. So when you set up a game of Marvel Champions, you always include the Standard encounter set, and then if you want to play on Expert, you also include the Expert encounter set. So they gave us new versions of those that are basically just much harder versions. The cards all do similar things. There's basically an analog for each one, but it's just a harder version. They'd added Surge and Overkill or something to it. And so, you take the cards you're used to and just expect them to be a little bit nastier, but they're a lot nastier. I find Standard 2 to be an incredibly difficult way to play. And one of the ways is this Formidable Foe card they added that is a permanent card that comes into play at setup, and it gives the villain Steady. So anytime you're playing Standard 2, the villain is always going to have Steady, which means it's going to be twice as difficult to stun or confuse them. And as someone who only plays solo most of the time and really enjoys the stun and confuse effects, I hate this card so much because it really hampers certain heroes and makes them a lot less effective, because certain heroes really rely on those status effects as part of their kit, and so they're getting a lot less value out of those cards that you had no choice to put in your deck. And if you play on the Expert 2 version, and if you're playing in Expert mode, you also have Formidable Foe flipped over, where not only does it give everybody Steady, but it also gives you an acceleration icon, and in solo that is brutal. In 4-player, that's nothing. One more threat per round is negligible with 4 heroes, but with one, that one is doubling the threat that goes on the thing. So I find these to be really unbalanced for solo. I can say I never used them. Shadows of the Past is the same, but everything else is a harder version of the original, and the Expert 2 cards are just insane. There's one that goes and gets your Nemesis minion, which that's pretty cool actually, more ways to get your Nemesis out. But Ruination is nuts. Discard cards from the top of the encounter deck till a side scheme is out, reveal it, and then put 2 threat on each scheme in play, and it has Incite 1, so it's already putting a threat on the main scheme. Like, this card really can ruin you, just putting out so much threat. Cruel Intentions gives every player in the game an extra face down encounter card, and it surges, so you're getting 2, and it gives the villain a boost card. And then Slug It Out is a super annoying version of Exhaustion that exhausts you and deals you 2 damage. So these are incredibly nasty cards. So if you're looking for more of a challenge, if you think the game's too easy, or you play multiplayer, the game is definitely easier in multiplayer. These might be fun, but for me, for solo, no thank you. I never use these, and I don't know if I ever will. I don't need the game to be that hard. But that is a very minor quibble for everything that comes in this pack. It's so super worth it. I think a fun villain, but even if you don't care about the villain, getting all those encounter sets is awesome. And the next hero we come to in this very weird up and down cycle is Valkyrie. And before Valkyrie came out, she was the most excited I had ever been for a hero. After reading the Valkyrie preview article and learning about this death glow mechanism here, that you put it on minions, and then when Valkyrie kills that minion, she gets all kinds of bonuses, I could not have been more excited. I thought that sounded like so much fun. I mentioned earlier that I really like the Asgard stuff anyway, so I was excited that they made her into a character, and I was just really looking forward to playing her. Unfortunately, when she was released in other parts of the world before she was released here, the reports were coming in that people were not finding her to be very good. They were not enjoying her. They thought she played very clunkily, and that's pretty much where I came down on her as well. She doesn't work super well in solo because her whole thing revolves around killing minions, but the bonuses for killing them aren't as great as I had initially hoped. If she has her Valhalla in play, she can draw a card and heal 1 damage, but you can only do that once a turn. And pretty much all of her cards require her to have the death glow attached to an enemy to make use of them, and it's really hard to move the death glow around, and so I find her very inconsistent and difficult to play in solo. Now, I've heard in multiplayer, especially 3 and 4 player games, where the only thing she has to focus on is killing minions, is that she can be a ton of fun to play. So take my opinion with a grain of salt. Some people really like her, but I find in solo play she can be very difficult to use. Now, she's not terrible. She has a lot of fun cards like Chooser the Slain lets you bring a minion out and then draw 2 cards. And it's kind of interesting how this works, because you just can search the encounter deck or discard pile. So you just find whatever the weakest minion is, and you just keep bringing them out over and over again and then smacking them down. So thematically, it's a little strange, but it makes for a fun thing. You know, you pull it out, draw 2 cards, put the death glow on it, kill it. Unfortunately, there's not anything in here that helps pay for the death glow, and that is, I didn't go over that very well. It's a 1-cost upgrade that starts the game set aside, so it's not in your hand, and then you attach it to a minion by paying its cost of 1, and then after you kill the minion, you get to ready Valkyrie, which is cool, and then the death glow gets set aside again, waiting to be attached to another enemy. And you can also attach it to the villain, but there's no way to move it once it's been attached other than going to your alter ego. And this is the other hero I mentioned that's really bad at thwarting, but needs to go to alter ego to really work as well as they're meant to. And again, in solo, that's just really hard to do. So I don't want to keep harping on that, but so there's nothing in here that helps pay for the death glow. There's nothing in here that moves the death glow around. So it does feel a little clunky. Sometimes it works great. You know, if you get a lot of minions out that you can easily kill, you just keep chopping them down and readying. That was the thing I was super looking forward to. But other times it can just be hard to trigger her cards, because you either have the death glow attached to the villain and then you can't get it off of there because you can't get the alter ego, or there's just no minions coming out for you to attach it to, and then you can't trigger half her cards. So she can just be a little weird. But again, I've heard in multiplayer she could be a ton of fun, and so I don't want to take too much away from her, but she was pretty disappointing to me. And I think the general consensus is she's middle tier or less. So this might not be a hero to be super excited to run out and get, but there's definitely some fun to be had here. And she did come with some really good aggression cards. The Thor ally, it was really cool just to be able to have Thor for any aggression deck. Throg is a really, really good 2-cost aggression ally that comes in with tough if you're engaged with the minion. If you're playing Valkyrie or Thor, that's who he's meant to be hanging out with, you're probably going to be engaged with the minion, so that is a really good ally. Came with some reprints here. Quick Strike is really neat. It deals damage to an enemy equal to your attack. There's a lot of combo potential for that. Smash the Problem gave aggression an interesting way to do thwart by exhausting your hero and removing threat from a scheme equal to your hero's attack. It's unfortunate that you have to exhaust your hero, but I guess it would probably be too good if you didn't, but that's still a pretty good card. And then the Best Defense defends based on your attack. So everything revolved around how high you could get your attack, and then these events would be even better based on that. And she came with some decent Asgard support. It was nice to get that. She had the Bifrost support that lets you search your deck for an Asgard ally and play it. You had to pay its cost, but still, that was pretty neat. You can go find Angela, you can go find Throg. There's not a ton of Asgard allies, but there's a few, and the Bifrost helps you find them. Godlike Stamina was a huge card, both for Valkyrie and Thor, that you can only play if you're Asgard, and there's only 2 we have currently. But it lets you heal 2 damage and discard a status card. So if you're playing Thor or Valkyrie, it's incredibly annoying if you get stunned, because their whole thing typically revolves around attacking. And it was nice to get a card that not only healed you a little bit, but also got rid of that status for you. So there were definitely some good cards in this pack to be had, especially if you're a fan of Thor. And then her off-aspect cards, Problem Solvers was the Justice Alliance card, is probably the best one, that lets you remove a lot of threat by exhausting an Avenger and a Guardian. And then you remove threat from each scheme in play equal to the combined thwart of those characters. So even if you don't have big thwarters, you're only moving 2 or 3 from each scheme in play, in multiplayer at least, that's going to be really, really powerful against certain villains. Here's the blue training card, which actually I think is kind of the best one, because there's some really, really good blue events that you're going to want to get shuffled back into your deck that you can just keep abusing over and over again. Anticipation, finally we got a new preparation card that Black Widow might be interested in, that lets you discard it to ready your hero when you engage a minion. So not necessarily a ton of synergy with Black Widow. She's not necessarily looking to engage minions, but still it was nice to get a new card for that. And then Cosmic Alliance was the basic alliance card that let you ready an Avenger and a Guardian. It's okay. I kind of wish it only cost 2. So an interesting hero, an okay pack. I think Valkyrie overall is probably one of the lesser good packs in the game, but still pretty good. Thankfully, we end this roller coaster of a cycle on a high note with the Vision. Vision here is a fascinating hero to play. He's another form changer in that he has an intangible form and a dense form, so he can pass through things or he can be solid. And this makes for a really interesting design where most of his cards have to be played in either dense form or intangible form. Now, unlike Spectrum, you can choose to change forms once per turn. And so there's a lot of strategy and thinking that goes into which form you want to be in, which form you want to end your turn in, which form you want to be in when you go to Alter Ego, because that changes some things too. And so Vision was fun right out of the pack because he was incredibly tricky to play. The first 2 or 3 games with Vision I found to be just really mind-bending. You had to really think hard, and I found him to be a lot of fun. Now, don't let his stats deceive you here. It says 2 thwart, 0 attack, and 0 defense. but when he's in his dense form, he gets +2 attack and +2 defense. So he's a 2/2/2 hero most of the time, and he plays really well. He's a lot of really interesting cards. His signature ally Vivian is probably the most powerful signature ally in the game, where she can either thwart for 3 or attack for 3 for only the cost of 2. And he has a support that will actually summon an android ally, so her most of the time. And if there's any criticism I have for Vision, it's that Vivian might be a little too strong, and when you play him, it really sometimes can just boil down to how many times can I get Vivian in play and just use her and maybe build decks all around trying to get her stronger and keeping her in play, things like that. But that's a pretty minor quibble, actually. His other cards are very interesting, so you don't have to focus on Vivian. He has a resource generator. His cape gives him stalwart potentially, or retaliate, and having a hero that can have stalwart is super awesome. Getting stunned and confused is so annoying. He has cards that let him get his cards back, which this was a really smart thing to include in his kit, because it is entirely possible that you're going to have cards in your hand that don't fit with which form you're in, or maybe you drew them after you changed forms and now you can't play them. And so these density control cards can help you get the cards back in your hand right when you need them. Solar Beam is a really versatile card in that it's his big attack event, but it's also his big thwart event, in that if he's in dense form, it deals 7 damage, and if he's in intangible form, it removes 5 threats. So it's not as much damage as your average hero's 3-cost event, but I think it makes up for it in its versatility. If you really need to remove a lot of threat, it's nice that they are both on this one card. Super Dense Strike is an absolutely awesome attack. It deals 5 damage and piercing. I'm a huge fan of piercing. I always find that very nice to have. Just passing through has to be the best card title in the whole game. As he's phasing through that wall there, it's just hilarious. He has a really strong defense event that he can prevent all the damage and stun the enemy if he's in his dense form. And if he's in his intangible form, he can play Phase Disruption that allows you to confuse the villain, and it's always nice to have Confuse built into your hero kit. There's not a lot of that in this game. But it also lets you remove those annoying attachments that villains have that give them like retaliate or the ability to stun, and then you have to spend 3 resources to get rid of them. This card will just take one off, and that is such a cool way to emulate Vision's powers. When he goes through things, he really disrupts, especially electronics and things like that. So that's just a really neat thing to be able to go in, and not only do you confuse them, you also take away their attachments. So there's a lot of good things to say about Vision. He plays well in all the aspects. He can really do a little bit of everything, and I think he's been a big hit. I think people really like Vision, and so he ended this cycle off on a high note. Very well done. He came as a protection hero, and he had some really popular protection cards. He came with a lot of these androids, and he himself has some android support in his own deck, and of course he's going to want more to play with. So Jocasta, Protector, and Victor Mancha are all interesting allies. Protector I don't think sees a lot of play, but Jocasta and Victor Mancha are really good. But I think the most popular card that came out of this pack was Flow Like Water. This really feeds into the defense strategy that just wants to play a lot of events. And now when you have this in play, you also get to deal damage every time you play a defense event. And when you're already pinging for Retaliate and pinging for your electrostatic armor and pinging with your sidestep, and now you're also pinging with Flow Like Water, you can really cut the villain down very quickly, and makes for a fun protection strategy that it needed a little bit of damage to it. Defiance is a really strong card that simply discards the boost card on an enemy before it's flipped up. You do run the risk of flipping over a boost card that wasn't going to do anything, but sometimes you're going to cancel a 3 boost or a boost with an annoying boost effect, and so I really like this card a lot. Machine Man is a pretty useful 2-cost basic ally that can go on any deck that you can, if you have any leftover resources, you can put them into him to get more thwart or attack. Reboot is huge for Vision in that it readies a friendly android character and heals 1 damage from it. It's no surprise that Vivian is here in the picture, because that's pretty much what you're going to be using it on. Getting extra uses out of Vivian is huge. So my copies of Reboot actually are sitting in Vision's kit, because there's no reason to put them anywhere else. Every time I build a Vision deck, always 3 copies of Reboot. It's a really useful card for him, but not a lot of uses outside of that. We get the red training card that shuffles red events back into the deck. It's just okay. Chance Encounter is a really cool card that attaches to side schemes. I mentioned this earlier with like one way or another. If you're going to bring out side schemes, and you can use cards like this to take benefit of it. It lets you search your deck or discard pile for an ally, so you can keep recycling certain allies. I've had a lot of fun using this with allies like Nick Fury or Mockingbird, and just getting their benefits over and over again. And Joining Forces is a really fascinating alliance card that allows you, for the cost of 4 as a group, to put an Avenger ally and a Guardian ally into play. And so there could be a lot of fun table talk to be had with that card. And then the other big card that came out of Vision was Meditation. This card is awesome. I used this in every deck for a long time after Vision came out. It's an alter ego action. You have to exhaust your alter ego, but then it lets you play a card from your hand, reducing its resource cost by 3. And so this can really jumpstart a lot of strategies. There's a lot of really useful cards that cost 3 that you can use this to play for free at the low cost of exhausting your hero. That is a worthy thing to do most of the time, to get a beat cop into play, or a sonic rifle into play, or an expensive ally into play right from the start, only by playing this card. Very, very strong. Certain heroes that already want to be an alter ego a lot, like Nebula, Black Widow, Iron Man, can make a lot of use out of this card. War Machine, very, very good and very welcome to the card pool. And one final note, I don't often talk about the Nemesises, but just the fact that he comes with Ultron as a Nemesis set is really cool. It basically turns the scenario into the Ultron scenario. He gets an Ultron drones card, and then you start putting drones into play. And that's just such a clever idea. So they really, I think, high marks for Vision. They knocked it out of the park in every single way. So that brings us to the end of Cycle 4. Like I said, a bit of a roller coaster here. Some up, some down. The Mad Titan Shadow box was incredible. The heroes were somewhat of a mixed bag. And it didn't help that before the cycle was over, they had already announced that the next campaign box was going to be the Sinister Motives box, highlighting the Spider-Verse heroes and leading into a Spider-Verse cycle. And I think the hype for that greatly outgrew the excitement we had for some of these leftover characters that they were bringing out in this cycle.